this video I'm going to be covering Impacket secrets dump, and big shout out to one of our viewers, Rishab Gupta, hopefully I pronounced that right, for suggesting covering some of the Impacket tools. So this is going to be a new series that I'll be creating on this channel where we dedicate a video to a different Impacket tool on each video in the series. So where I wanted to start was secrets dump. Pretty similar or pretty simple to understand tool here. And man, it really feels good to finally be back and creating content for you guys now that the course launched. Definitely go ahead and sign up if you haven't already and you would like to for the Web App Pen Testing Fundamentals course down in the description below. And bear with me for a second. My developer's trying to fix the layout of the text on the screen, especially on the smaller screen sizes, because we were testing it with a 1080p monitor and it looks great in that resolution in our screen size. But yeah, the CSS, he's working on creating like media queries and things like that. So the site didn't get hacked or anything like that. We just got to iron out some of the kinks and then we'll be good to go. It's always tough when you're launching first course, building your site for the first time. But yeah, on to the content. Enough rambling there. Let's get into this here. We have, I have a box that I am targeting right now, and the use case for secrets dump, right? Let's just take a look at the help first. So I could do, secrets dump, and then I could do attack H for help. And it's always a good place to start. So performs various techniques to dump secrets from the remote machine without executing any agent there. So this is really cool. You can use Mimikatz to do this as well, but it would be you would run that on the local machine. So let's just take a step back here for a second and explain, what is this and what is the use case. So as the name implies, secrets dump will dump the secrets, or basically password hashes, for all the accounts on the server. If you do it against a local system, if you do it against a domain controller, you can also dump the hashes to all the users on the domain. So I'll also say this is a lot more dangerous than it may initially appear if you're not too familiar with Windows, because as I'll show you later on in this video, in Windows, if you get a password hash, if you get an NTLM hash, in many cases, you don't even need to crack that hash. You could just authenticate with the hash. It's pretty crazy, actually. It's a technique known as pass the hash. Probably a lot of you guys are familiar, but if you weren't, it is some pretty cool stuff. But with secrets dump, we can actually dump the SAM database remotely. Now, what is the SAM database, right? Or the SAM, right? So the SAM is basically, think of it as the Windows version of the Etsy shadow file, essentially. If you're familiar with Etsy shadow in Linux, that is a file that holds all the the password hashes. The equivalent for Windows, if you can get the SAM, you can get all the in most cases get all the hashes. So it's also important to know, similar to the Etsy shadow file, right? You can only access that if you're the root account, right? So similarly, we can only access the SAM if we are an administrator, which is Windows version of basically being a root user, if you will. Now, there are situations that you might think like, well, okay, we have to be administrator anyway, so how can this actually help us? Well, there's actually a number of ways that this can come into play for you. One way is, if you get administrator through some kind of other means on the system and you dump the SAM, you could get people's hashes and maybe you reuse that same password on other domains, other areas of the network, right? Then, or even within that same domain, right? You could actually authenticate to them in many cases on other services and things like that. And it will really help you to pivot around the network. You pretty much owned all of the users on the network or on the domain or the local system, whatever the case may be at that point. So it is extremely useful even as a post-exploitation, but this is also useful in some cases in CTFs as well, because there is attacks like what are known as DC sync attacks, where you could basically impersonate a domain controller. You know what? Let's go into that right now. And I just want to dedicate a little time to explaining this because this is some really cool stuff. It'll help you on CTFs. It'll help you with real world stuff as well. So let's get into that. I found this article to be really useful in explaining what DC sync attacks are if you happen to not be familiar. So a DC sync attack uses Microsoft, long name here, Microsoft Directory Replication Service, Remote Protocol, MSDRSR, like I said, to pretend to be a domain controller in order to get user credentials from another DC. So, in most environments, you have multiple DCs. Basically, we can make our, if we have the rights to do this, this requires a certain level of privilege to conduct a DC sync attack as well. I want to point that out. But if you do have those privileges, then you can basically spoof as if your machine is a domain controller or the account that you compromised, right? That it's the domain controller. And it's going to request the SAM. You can request the SAM database from the target domain. And here's why this happens, right? These attacks will leverage what is a necessary function in Active Directory, which complicates attempts to prevent them. Large-scale networks require many DCs to function, and each of those DCs need to have up-to-date information that requires a function, allowing one DC to update another DC on any changes, like updated credential information, which is why it needs to be able to have access to the SAM, and that's basically what we're exploiting here. So attackers subvert that necessary function by pretending to be a DC, and here's what's happening under the hood. It's going to use ds get nc changes function to request password hashes. A common attack uses this method to get the KRB TGT hash, golden ticket, right? It brings them one step closer to getting the golden ticket. But yeah, like I was saying, DC sync requires a compromised user account with domain replication privileges. So the with domain replication privileges is the big asterisk here. You need that in order to be able to conduct this attack. And once that's established, one can find a domain controller, tell it to replicate, get the password hashes, and from its subsequent response. So that's one way that you could actually use this to pivot, in fact. And so let's just say through one way or another, maybe it was through a DC sync attack like we just explained, or maybe it was through legitimately becoming the administrator user. One way or another, we have administrator access. We have access to dump the SAM. This is one way to do it. Like I said, we could use Mimikatz. We could use a number of tools on the system. We could also do it remotely with secretsdump. And the notation you use for this can be a little bit tricky. So this should help you guys out if you're running this. So what you could say is Impacket secretsdump. And then you want to specify the domain you're running against. Now, this was a hack-the-box machine with a domain of http.local, so I can just use that there. As you see, I've typed this command before. Then the user that we're going to authenticate on behalf of. So like I said, requires already having user-level access. So I created an account of Selfmade, and then my password, I use Selfmade for that. So you do username, :password, and then at the IP address of the target domain controller. And then I believe it will try to dump it like the local SAM, which we won't have access through DC sync in this case, because I use DC sync on this box. So we're going to say just DC. This is an optional parameter you could tack on. But this part is the truly important part here. You want to make sure that you start off with the domain and then a slash, and then the username, :password at the target. So we can run that. And we see dumping domain credentials, and here they are, all of the hashes, the NTLM hashes, including the most interestingly, the administrator, the administrator hash. I wasn't sure if I was in TMUX. I'm still getting used to this new VM here. But yeah, so this is the most important part of the hash. If you're not used to looking at Windows hashes here, we have the LM hash, which is a deprecated thing. It used to be used back in Windows 2000, Server 2008 and before. If you notice, all the ones on the left side of the colon are the same. That's because this is the LM hash for an empty password. So don't worry about that. What you need is the second part, which is known as the NTLM hash. This is basically a stronger form of hashing here. Stronger hashing algorithm that is actually used by Windows. So what we can do is all we need to do is copy this. This is how simple it is. And then we can use a tool called Evil WinRM, because on this box, the Windows remoting protocol happened to be open. That's port 5985, I do believe. And we can tell it we want to use this IP address. And for the account, we want to use the administrator account. And we want to log in with a password hash. So we do the capital uppercase H, pass in the hash. And we should be able to do a pass to the hash attack. And now if I run a who am I, we are the administrator user. So we have fully owned this box. We have fully owned this domain, domain controller, the entire domain at this point, right? As you saw, we have all the password hashes, everything. So that's what you can do. Now let's say that WinRM wasn't open, the Windows remoting protocol. Basically, this is like the SSH version of, or like the Windows version of like an SSH shell, but you get PowerShell instead. It's used for administrators and things like that, normally on domain controllers and Windows servers. But if this port was not open, most likely SMB will be, and the admin should certainly have write access to either the C share or the admin share, if not both. And we could use psexec to get a shell. So those are some multiple ways for you to do this stuff. Going a little bit beyond just Impacket, secretsdump, but hopefully that helps clear up how to use the tool. Super useful, not too much to it, so I want to include some bonus tips for you guys. And if you want some bonus content, speaking of that, I have it right on screen for you guys right now. I'll see you guys right over there. Thanks for watching.